In 1836, a doctor at Bellevue Hospital performed the first successful cesarean section in the history of American medicine. The mother survived. The child survived. And the operating table was 20 feet from a room where the city chained its mentally ill to iron rings bolted into the floor. That is Bellevue. For nearly 300 years, this single public hospital on the east side of Manhattan has been the place where American medicine performed its greatest miracles and committed its worst sins, sometimes on the same afternoon, sometimes in the same hallway. Most cities would have torn it down and started over. New York just kept rebuilding it. Chapter 1: The almshouse that swallowed a city. Before Bellevue was a hospital, it was a place where New York hid the people it could not bear to look at. In 1736, on a plot of land that would one day become City Hall Park, the city of New York completed a 2-story brick building and called it the Public Workhouse and House of Correction. The cost of construction was 80 pounds sterling and 50 gallons of rum. That second detail tells you everything about who this building was for. It was not a place of healing. It was a place of sorting. The sick, the drunk, the orphaned, the insane, the merely poor. They all entered the same door. The building made no distinction between them because the city saw no distinction worth making. The infirmary occupied the second floor. 6 beds. 1 doctor, a man named John Van Buren, who served simultaneously as physician, surgeon, and pharmacist. Downstairs, the able-bodied poor were put to work, sewing, knitting, spinning wool, hammering iron. The theory was simple and brutal. If you needed the city's help, the city would extract labor in return. Charity was a transaction, not a gift. New York in 1736 was a city of roughly 8,000 people, clinging to the southern tip of Manhattan like barnacles on a dock. It had no sewer system, no fire department, no police force. It had pigs roaming the streets to eat the garbage, which was the closest thing the city had to a sanitation plan. And now it had an almshouse, which was its way of saying, "We acknowledge that some of our residents are suffering, and we would prefer to keep them in one place where the rest of us do not have to see them." This is the origin story of the oldest public hospital in America. Not a vision of medical progress, not a dream of compassionate care. A brick box built to contain embarrassment. The almshouse existed 40 years before the American Revolution. It predated the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and every institution Americans now take for granted. It was built at a time when the idea of a public hospital simply did not exist. There were hospitals for sailors. There were hospitals attached to churches. But the notion that a city government had an obligation to house and treat its poorest residents, that was not medicine. That was poor management. And the almshouse was the tool. For the next 60 years, the building grew the way a tumor grows, not by design, but by pressure. As the city's population doubled and doubled again, the facility absorbed more and more of the people that commerce and ambition left behind. By 1795, the almshouse held 655 residents. More than 3/4 of them were immigrants. They slept on straw mats in rooms with no ventilation. The sick lay beside the healthy. The dying lay beside the newborn. A single building was expected to contain all of human suffering, and the city kept pouring more in. By 1787, Columbia University's College of Physicians and Surgeons had begun sending faculty and medical students to the almshouse infirmary. This was the first hint of something that nobody had planned. The concentration of so many desperate patients in one place was creating, almost by accident, one of the richest teaching environments in the Western Hemisphere. Medical students could observe diseases they would never encounter in private practice. They could watch conditions progress from onset to death in a matter of days. They could practice procedures on patients who had no alternative and therefore no power to refuse. The almshouse was a catastrophe for its residents and a classroom for its doctors. That equation, the exchange of suffering for knowledge, would define Bellevue for the next 3 centuries. It would produce some of the most important medical breakthroughs in American history, and it would do so at a cost that no one who benefited from those breakthroughs would ever be asked to pay. The question that hangs over this period is the one that will follow the building for the rest of its history. How does a warehouse for the unwanted become the most important hospital in America? The answer begins with a catastrophe that arrived by ship. Chapter 2: Epidemic as Architecture. Yellow fever did not ask New York to build a hospital. It forced the city to choose who was worth saving. In the summer of 1795, the fever came. It arrived in the holds of trading ships from the Caribbean, carried by mosquitoes that bred in the stagnant water pooling along the East River docks. Nobody understood the mechanism. They only understood the symptoms: a sudden fever, vomiting, skin turning the color of old parchment. Then, for the unlucky, a bloody hemorrhage that could empty a body in hours. By the time the outbreak ended, over 700 New Yorkers were dead. The wealthiest residents fled to their country homes. The poor had no country homes. They stayed and died, or they went to the almshouse and died there, surrounded by other dying people, under a roof that offered shelter, but nothing resembling medicine. The city's response revealed a truth that would define public health in America for the next 2 centuries. Epidemics do not create new policies. They expose the absence of old ones. New York had no quarantine system, no isolation wards, no plan for separating the contagious from the merely ill. The almshouse, already bursting, became a death trap. Putting fever patients in the same rooms as orphans and the elderly was not just negligent, it was arithmetic. Bodies in, bodies out. In 1798, the city purchased a piece of farmland several miles north of the settled city, along the East River. The property was called Bellevue, French for beautiful view, a name given by the estate's original owner for the panorama of the river and the Long Island shore. The name would become one of the great ironies in American history. Within a generation, it would be synonymous not with beauty, but with suffering. Within 2 generations, it would be slang for madness itself. The purchase was practical, not visionary. The city needed somewhere to quarantine the sick during future outbreaks, and Bellevue Farm, remote and surrounded by open land, offered distance from the crowded downtown streets. It was not yet a hospital. It was a holding ground, a place to put the people the city needed to keep alive, but did not want nearby. Then came cholera. In 1832, the disease swept through New York with a violence that made yellow fever look gentle. Cholera killed fast. A person could be healthy at breakfast and dead by nightfall. It thrived in filth, in overcrowded tenements, in the same conditions that filled the almshouse year after year. Over 3,500 New Yorkers died in that single summer. The city's wealthy fled to the countryside again. The poor, again, had nowhere to go. They went to Bellevue. After cholera came typhus. The great epidemic of 1847 arrived with the Irish famine immigrants, tens of thousands of them packed into the tenements of the Lower East Side, already weakened by starvation and the brutal Atlantic crossing. Many of them had spent weeks in the holds of coffin ships, so named because the mortality rate on some voyages exceeded 30%. Typhus spread through lice, through crowded sleeping quarters, through the shared misery of poverty. It killed thousands. And once again, the dying were brought to Bellevue because there was nowhere else. Each epidemic forced new construction. After yellow fever, new quarantine buildings. After cholera, a new hospital wing. After typhus, another expansion. By 1811, the city had purchased 150 acres of additional land around the Kips Bay site. The complex now stretched from 23rd Street to 28th Street along the East River. It included an almshouse, a prison, an infirmary, and an insane asylum, all sharing the same grounds, sometimes sharing the same walls. By 1824, the city formally named the facility Bellevue Hospital. The word hospital was still generous, but the name mattered. It meant the city was admitting, however reluctantly, that what happened inside those walls was medicine. The pattern was set. Crisis was the only architect the city would ever listen to. Nobody in New York's government woke up one morning and decided to build a great public hospital. Instead, wave after wave of disease forced the city to build something, anything, fast enough to absorb the dying. Bellevue was not designed. It was accumulated, layer by layer, epidemic by epidemic, one emergency at a time. And medicine, once named, develops ambitions of its own. The building was about to surprise everyone. Chapter 3: The Scalpel and the Chain. By 1840, Bellevue doctors were inventing modern surgery in rooms that smelled like an open sewer. This is the chapter where the contradiction at the heart of Bellevue becomes impossible to ignore. On one side of the hospital, physicians were performing procedures that had never been attempted in the Western Hemisphere. On the other side, human beings were chained to iron rings. And the corridor between those two realities was sometimes no wider than a single hallway. Start with the miracles. In 1847, Bellevue became one of the first public hospitals in America to use ether anesthesia during surgery. Before that year, the only tool available for managing a patient's pain during amputation was speed. A good surgeon could remove a leg in 90 seconds. Anesthesia changed everything. It meant surgeons could slow down. They could be precise. They could attempt operations that would have been unthinkable when the patient was screaming and thrashing on the table. The era of careful, deliberate surgery began in rooms where the smell of open sewage drifted through unscreened windows. In 1849, Bellevue opened an amphitheater for clinical teaching and surgery, one of the first in the country. Medical students sat in tiered rows above the operating table, watching real procedures on real patients. It was theatrical and gruesome and revolutionary. In 1861, the Bellevue Hospital Medical College opened its doors, the first medical school in New York directly connected to a hospital. Students could learn theory in the morning and watch it applied to living patients in the afternoon. This seems obvious now. In 1861, it was a radical experiment in education. Then came the Civil War, and with it a man named Edward Dalton. A surgeon who had served as medical inspector of the United States Sanitary Commission, Dalton had watched soldiers bleed to death on battlefields because there was no organized system to bring the wounded to medical tents. He had helped develop military ambulance corps that could move injured men quickly from the field to the surgeon. When the war ended, Dalton carried that idea home to New York. On June 4th, 1869, a horse-drawn wagon left Bellevue Hospital and raced through the streets of Lower Manhattan toward a reported accident. Inside the wagon sat a surgical intern, a driver, and a kit that included bandages, splints, tourniquets, sponges, a quart of brandy, and a vial of iron solution to stop bleeding. This was the first hospital-based civilian ambulance run in the history of New York City. The wagon weighed 800 pounds and had rudimentary shock absorbers, an innovation borrowed directly from battlefield ambulances. In its first year, Bellevue's 2 ambulances answered over 1,400 calls for help. By the following year, the hospital had added 5 more wagons, each one dispatched by telegraph, the same communication system the police used. Emergency medicine, as a concept, had been born on the streets of Manhattan. In 1873, Bellevue opened the first professional nursing school in America based on the principles of Florence Nightingale. Before this, nursing was not a trained profession. It was a task given to whoever was available, often the least educated and lowest paid workers in the hospital. The Bellevue Training School created a curriculum. It established standards. It produced graduates who went on to transform hospitals across the country. A children's clinic in 1874, an emergency pavilion in 1876, the nation's first pathology and bacteriology laboratory in 1884, a men's nursing school in 1888. The hospital was not just practicing medicine, it was inventing the institutions of modern medicine, one department at a time. Now turn the page, walk down the hall, enter the insane asylum. The psychiatric patients at Bellevue lived in a world that existed on the other side of the same walls where those medical breakthroughs were happening. In the early decades, mental health patients were housed in basement cells, receiving nothing beyond restraint and confinement. They slept on bare floors. They were bound with leather straps, and in some cases, iron chains bolted directly to the walls. The treatment philosophy, if it could be called that, was containment. Keep them still, keep them quiet, keep them out of sight. The conditions reflected a prevailing belief that mental illness was the result of moral failing, even demonic possession. The patients were not sick. They were fallen, and fallen people did not deserve comfort. By the middle of the 19th century, Bellevue's psychiatric wards held hundreds of patients. Many of them were not mentally ill in any clinical sense. They were immigrants who could not speak English. They were women committed by husbands who wanted to be rid of them. They were the elderly, the addicted, the simply poor. Once inside, there was almost no mechanism for getting out. The diagnosis of insanity, once applied, stuck like a brand. Act 1 closes here, at the peak of the paradox. Bellevue in the 1870s was simultaneously the most advanced and the most brutal medical institution in the Western Hemisphere. The miracle and the cruelty fed from the same source. And someone was about to walk in and tell the world what was happening behind the walls. Chapter 4. What the wards concealed. The nurses trained at Bellevue learned medicine in the daylight and learned silence after dark. To understand what happened next, you need to understand the geography of the building itself. Bellevue in the 1870s and 80s was not a single hospital. It was a sprawling compound of structures stretching from 23rd Street to 28th Street along the East River. A campus of misery covering multiple city blocks. The main hospital wards faced the avenue. Behind them, further from public view, sat the insane pavilion. And beyond that, accessible by ferry across the East River, sat Blackwell's Island, where the city housed its most severe psychiatric cases in a separate asylum connected to Bellevue by an administrative chain that blurred all accountability. The conditions in these hidden wards were not a secret. They were an open secret, the kind of truth that everyone in the medical establishment knew and nobody discussed in polite company. Patients were fed rancid butter and spoiled meat. They drank water from the East River, untreated and brown with sewage. In winter, the wards were unheated. Women sat in thin cotton dresses on wooden benches for hours, forbidden to move, forbidden to speak. The staff who watched over them were not nurses in any modern sense. They were custodial workers with no medical training and a great deal of contempt for their charges. Violence was not an aberration, it was a management technique. Into this landscape walked a 23-year-old journalist named Elizabeth Cochran, who wrote under the name Nellie Bly. In September of 1887, Bly convinced her editors at Joseph Pulitzer's New York World to let her attempt something no reporter had done before. She would feign insanity, get herself committed, and then write about what she found. The assignment was dangerous and unprecedented. Nobody, including Bly herself, had a clear plan for how to get her out once she was in. "First get in," Pulitzer's editor told her when she asked about her exit strategy. Bly's preparation was theatrical and methodical. She rented a room at a boarding house for working women called the Temporary Home for Females on 2nd Avenue in Manhattan. She stayed up all night, staring at herself in the mirror, practicing the wide-eyed look of disturbance. She read ghost stories to put herself in an unsettled state of mind. The next morning, she began accusing the other boarders of being insane. She refused to sleep. She claimed amnesia. Within days, the police were called. A judge examined her and pronounced her demented. Doctors at Bellevue's insane pavilion confirmed the diagnosis. Not one of the medical professionals who examined Bly detected the performance. Not one asked the questions that might have revealed a sane woman pretending to be ill. From Bellevue, she was sent by ferry to the Women's Lunatic Asylum on Blackwell's Island. The asylum had been built for roughly 1,000 patients. When Bly arrived, it held over 1,600. The budget had been cut repeatedly. Only 16 doctors remained on staff to care for the entire population. Once inside, Bly immediately dropped her act. She spoke clearly. She was calm, polite, and rational. She asked to be released. None of it mattered. Her sanity, once officially denied, could not be reclaimed by simply demonstrating it. The doctors dismissed her clarity as another symptom of her illness. She was trapped, just like the other women on the ward, many of whom, she realized with growing horror, were not insane at all. Some were immigrants who spoke no English and had been committed because nobody could understand their attempts to explain themselves. Some had been committed by abusive husbands. Some were simply old and poor, discarded by families who could no longer afford to care for them. The asylum was not just a hospital for the mad, it was a dumping ground for the inconvenient. For 10 days, Bly lived the life of a patient. She ate the same rotten food. She sat on the same hard benches in rooms so cold she could see her breath. She endured the cold baths that staff used as punishment, plunging patients into frigid water and holding them under until they stopped struggling. She gathered testimony from the women around her, listening to stories of lives erased by a system that required no evidence of insanity beyond someone's willingness to make the accusation. When her editor finally sent a lawyer to secure her release, Bly had enough material for the most famous piece of investigative journalism of the 19th century. Her series, published in the New York World in October of 1887 and later collected as a book titled 10 Days in a Madhouse, was a national sensation. The public was outraged. A grand jury was impaneled to investigate conditions at both Bellevue and Blackwell's Island. The city increased funding for the Department of Public Charities and Corrections, boosting the budget from $1.5 million to $2.33 million. An additional $50,000 was specifically earmarked for the Blackwell's Island Asylum. Bly herself later wrote with satisfaction that on the strength of her reporting, the Committee of Appropriation provided an additional $1 million for the benefit of the insane. 7 years after the exposé was published, the Blackwell's Island Asylum closed entirely. Here is the part of the story that rarely gets told. The reforms were real but shallow. Conditions improved briefly at Bellevue and its affiliated institutions. Better food was served. Cleaner bedding appeared. Some of the most abusive staff were dismissed. Then, slowly, inevitably, the wards slid back toward their natural state of overcrowding and neglect. The fundamental problem had not changed. Bellevue was expected to house and treat every person the city could not place elsewhere, with a budget that covered a fraction of the actual need. Bly's reporting changed the conversation. It did not change the math. The psychiatric wards continued to fill. By the 1890s, the number of patients processed through Bellevue's system each year had climbed into the tens of thousands. The hospital had become a revolving door for the city's most vulnerable. And something else was happening, something that would prove even harder to undo than the physical conditions. Bellevue's name was changing, not on the building, in the language. Chapter 5. Tearing down the evidence. Every time New York demolished a wing of Bellevue, it was trying to erase what had happened inside. Buildings tell the truth about the societies that build them, and Bellevue has been demolished and reconstructed so many times that its architectural history reads like a confession, written, burned, and rewritten across 3 centuries. Each version of the hospital was an attempt to fix what the previous version had revealed. Each demolition was an admission of failure, and each new structure rose on the same ground, over the same foundations, as if the city believed that changing the walls could change what happened within them. The original almshouse on the City Hall Park site lasted until the end of the 18th century, when overcrowding and epidemic forced the move to the Bellevue farm property along the East River. That first relocation was an act of quarantine disguised as expansion. The 1811 development turned the rural quarantine ground into a sprawling institutional campus, adding buildings for the insane, the impoverished, and the criminal alongside the sick. The complex covered 150 acres, stretching across 5 city blocks. It was, in scale, less like a hospital and more like a small town, one populated entirely by people the larger city had rejected. By 1836, new hospital wings were erected, and the facility was officially rechristened Bellevue Hospital. A fever hospital was added the following year. A new building for the insane went up shortly after. Each structure was a response to a specific crisis, constructed quickly and cheaply, with no overarching design philosophy beyond. Build it fast enough to hold the next wave. The most dramatic transformation came in the 1870s, when a massive Victorian complex rose on the site. This was the Bellevue that Nellie Bly entered. Grand in scale, if not in ambition, the new buildings featured ornate brickwork, high ceilings, and an architectural vocabulary borrowed from the great European hospitals. From the outside, the complex projected confidence and order. From the inside, the wards told a different story. The high ceilings meant the rooms were impossible to heat in winter. The long corridors, designed for efficient circulation, became wind tunnels that spread contagion from one ward to the next. The beautiful facade was, in the most literal sense, a facade. The building looked like progress. Inside, it operated like a warehouse. The scale of what Bellevue processed during this period defies easy comprehension. By 1900, over 100,000 patients passed through the hospital each year. 100,000 in a single facility. That is roughly the population of a mid-sized American city at the time, flowing through the doors of one institution every 12 months. The staff numbered in the hundreds, the beds numbered in the thousands, and still there were not enough. Patients slept in hallways. They slept on floors. They waited for days in corridors because there was no room in the wards and no other hospital in the city that would accept them. A major reorganization in 1902 created the Bellevue and Allied Hospitals Administrative System, a bureaucratic structure intended to professionalize the management of the city's public hospitals. The system linked Bellevue with Gouverneur Hospital, Harlem Hospital, and Fordham Hospital under a single administrative umbrella. It provided career opportunities to female and black physicians at a time when most private hospitals denied them positions entirely. This was quiet, structural progress. It did not make headlines. It did not capture the public imagination the way Bly's reporting had. But it mattered. It began to transform Bellevue from a chaotic dumping ground into something that, at least on paper, resembled a coordinated medical system. Each rebuilding cycle followed the same script. The old building would deteriorate beyond what the city could publicly tolerate. A scandal would erupt, usually involving patient deaths or conditions so appalling that even the tabloid press, accustomed to Bellevue's horrors, found them newsworthy. The city would allocate funds for demolition and reconstruction. New walls would go up. For a few years, conditions would improve. Then the population would grow, the funding would shrink, and the cycle would begin again. The 1811 rebuild was prompted by yellow fever. The 1836 expansion followed cholera. The Victorian complex of the 1870s was a response to decades of accumulated scandal. Each time, the architecture changed. Each time, the underlying problem remained identical. More patients than beds, more need than budget, more suffering than the building could hold. What makes this pattern so revealing is what it says about the relationship between architecture and accountability. Tear down the old building and you tear down the evidence. Erect a new one and you can tell the public that the problems have been solved. The bricks are clean, the corridors are wide, the windows let in light. For a brief moment, the new Bellevue looks like the hospital the city wants to believe it is. Then the wards fill, and the cycle resumes. The most ambitious attempt to break this cycle came in 1908, when the city began planning a completely new Bellevue complex to replace the decaying Victorian structures. The project would take decades. A new psychiatric pavilion opened in 1931. The main hospital building, a towering modernist block of brick and concrete, was not completed until 1939. It rose 25 stories above First Avenue, the tallest hospital building in the world at the time. The new Bellevue had over 2,500 beds, its own power plant, its own laundry facility, its own morgue. It was designed to be a self-contained city within a city, capable of handling every type of patient the metropolis could produce. The new building was a marvel of institutional architecture. It had to be. By the 1930s, Bellevue was not just a hospital, it was a system. The main building anchored a campus that included separate structures for psychiatry, pathology, administration, and outpatient services. The complex employed thousands. It trained hundreds of medical students and residents each year. It operated the busiest ambulance service in the Western Hemisphere, and it did all of this while remaining, as it had always been, the hospital that accepted patients nobody else would touch. But even the new building could not escape the old pattern. Within a decade of its completion, the wards were overcrowded. The infrastructure that had seemed so modern in 1939 was showing strain by 1950. The corridors that were supposed to be wide enough for efficient patient movement were lined with gurneys. The beds that were supposed to be sufficient were supplemented with cots. The cycle had resumed, this time in a building designed to prevent it. By the early 20th century, Bellevue occupied an entire stretch of First Avenue in the Kips Bay neighborhood, a row of buildings that locals would eventually nickname Bedpan Alley. The name was not affectionate, it was descriptive. Bellevue sat alongside Gouverneur Hospital, the city morgue, and a cluster of outpatient clinics, a line of institutional architecture that announced in stone and brick the exact neighborhoods where the city concentrated its least profitable patients. And the word attached to the most famous building on that row was about to take on a life far beyond the hospital's walls. Chapter 6. The word that became a weapon. Somewhere between 1910 and 1950, telling someone they belonged in Bellevue stopped being a diagnosis and became an insult. Language is a living thing, and words drift from their origins the way rivers drift from their sources. But what happened to the word Bellevue in the first half of the 20th century was not a gentle drift. It was a hijacking. The name of a hospital became the name of a condition. And once that transformation was complete, the building itself could never fully escape it. The process was gradual. In the late 19th century, Bellevue was already associated in the public mind with extreme psychiatric distress. Nellie Bly's reporting had sealed that connection. But the association was still geographic, still specific. To say someone was in Bellevue was to describe a location, a place where certain patients were sent. It carried stigma, but it referred to something real. By the early 20th century, the phrase had detached from geography entirely. He belongs in Bellevue became a way of saying someone was irrational, dangerous, or simply bizarre. Newspaper columnists used it as shorthand. Vaudeville comedians deployed it as a punchline. In Hollywood films from the 1930s and 40s, Bellevue appeared as a casual reference to madness, as familiar to American audiences as Timbuktu was for remoteness or Fort Knox for wealth. The word had become a metaphor, and the metaphor had eaten the institution. This linguistic transformation had real and measurable consequences. Consider the feedback loop it created. The word Bellevue signaled madness and desperation. Patients who could afford private hospitals would not go near a place synonymous with insanity. Their absence drained the hospital of the paying patients whose fees helped subsidize operations. With less revenue, conditions worsened. As conditions worsened, the stigma deepened. As the stigma deepened, more patients stayed away. Around and around it went, a spiral that no amount of medical excellence could break. The stigma extended beyond patients. Physicians who trained at Bellevue often found that listing the hospital on their resume carried a double edge. The clinical experience was unmatched. The association was toxic. Some doctors removed Bellevue from their professional biographies when seeking positions at private institutions. Others wore it as a badge of honor, knowing that no other residency in the country offered the breadth and intensity of cases they had seen. The hospital produced some of the finest emergency physicians, psychiatrists, and surgeons in America. Many of them learned their craft in conditions that would have been condemned at a veterinary clinic. And there was genuine medical excellence. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, Bellevue remained one of the most productive medical research institutions in the country. The firsts kept accumulating with a persistence that bordered on defiance. In 1911, Bellevue opened the nation's first ambulatory cardiac clinic. In 1917, it established the Western Hemisphere's first ward for metabolic disorders. In 1935, it created a public school for emotionally disturbed children, the first of its kind. In 1941, it became the site of the world's first hospital catastrophe unit, designed to handle mass casualty events. In 1942, two Bellevue physicians, André Cournand and Dickinson Richards, established the cardiopulmonary laboratory that would lead to the development of cardiac catheterization, a technique that allowed doctors, for the first time, to directly measure pressures and blood flow inside the living human heart. In 1952, Eugene Braunwald opened the nation's first heart failure clinic at Bellevue. And in 1956, Cournand and Richards shared the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for their work on cardiac catheterization. The Nobel Prize. At Bellevue, the hospital that the rest of America used as a synonym for madness. Richards himself captured the paradox in a complaint that became famous within the medical community. He could win the Nobel Prize in medicine, he said, but he could not take care of his patients at Bellevue. The institution was capable of world-changing research. It was also, simultaneously, incapable of providing basic services to the people who walked through its front door. The same system that attracted brilliant researchers with unlimited access to rare and complex cases also ensured that those cases would arrive in conditions of poverty and desperation that overwhelmed the hospital's resources. In 1962, Bellevue established the first intensive care unit in a municipal hospital. In 1964, it was designated as the standby hospital for treatment of visiting presidents, foreign dignitaries, injured members of the city's uniformed services, and United Nations diplomats. The hospital that America called a madhouse was now the hospital that treated the President of the United States when he visited New York. Nobody appeared to find this ironic, or perhaps everyone found it ironic but preferred not to say so. By mid-century, Bellevue had arrived at a moment of maximum tension. It was indispensable. No other hospital in New York would accept the volume of uninsured, undocumented, psychiatric, and criminal justice patients that Bellevue processed every day. It was also indefensible. The conditions in its wards, particularly the psychiatric wards, remained far below the standard of any private hospital in the city. The building was old, overcrowded, and underfunded. Its name had become a joke. Its patients had no political power, too essential to close, too broken to fix. That was Bellevue at the midpoint of the 20th century. The building stood on First Avenue like a question the city refused to answer. The answer, when it came, would not come from medicine or reform. It would come from money, specifically from the absence of it. Chapter 7: The City That Stopped Paying. In the 1970s, New York City went bankrupt, and Bellevue discovered what happens when a hospital's only patron has no money. To understand what happened to Bellevue in the last quarter of the 20th century, you have to understand what happened to the city around it. And what happened to New York in 1975 was, in financial terms, a cardiac arrest. The causes had been building for decades. Deindustrialization gutted the manufacturing base that had employed hundreds of thousands of working-class New Yorkers. The garment factories that had defined the Lower East Side. The printing houses that lined the waterfront. The light industry that filled warehouse districts from Brooklyn to the Bronx. All of it was leaving, moving to suburbs, to the South, to other countries where labor was cheaper and regulations thinner. With the factories went the jobs. With the jobs went the tax revenue. With the tax revenue went the city's ability to pay for itself. Meanwhile, white flight to the suburbs accelerated. The same highways and cheap housing developments that had drawn the middle class out of the city in the 1950s continued to pull residents away in the 60s and 70s. By the mid-70s, nearly 1 million people had left New York. Each one took their income, their spending, and their property taxes with them. The city's tax base was eroding like a riverbank. At the same time, expenses kept climbing. Higher wages for public workers, expanded services for the poor, a welfare system that was generous by national standards but funded on borrowed money and optimistic revenue projections. The city had the largest public hospital system in the country, the largest public university system, one of the largest police forces. All of it cost money, and the money was running out. For years, New York papered over the gap with short-term borrowing, using creative accounting to disguise the growing deficit. The banks that marketed the city's debt went along with it, because the commissions were profitable, and the assumption was that New York, being New York, would eventually right itself. In 1974, the banks stopped believing that assumption. They began selling their city bonds. By February of 1975, New York could no longer borrow. The total budget deficit was estimated at $12 billion. The city could not pay its employees. It could not service its debt. The Daily News headline in October of that year, when President Gerald Ford initially refused federal assistance, became one of the most famous front pages in American journalism. The cuts came, and they were savage. 6,000 police officers, 6,000 teachers, 2,500 firefighters. Transit fares increased. Tuition was imposed at the City University of New York for the first time, ending a century of free public higher education. Hospitals and health clinics were closed across the city. Drug treatment programs were eliminated. Class sizes in public schools swelled to 45 or 50 students. Libraries shortened their hours. Parks went unmanicured. Fire companies were disbanded in neighborhoods that would burn through the late 70s like slow-motion war zones. At Bellevue, the fiscal crisis manifested not as closure, but as erosion. You could close a neighborhood clinic. You could not close the hospital of last resort, but you could bleed it dry. Staff were cut. Supply budgets were slashed. Equipment broke and was not replaced. The physical plant, already aging, deteriorated visibly. Ceilings leaked. Paint peeled. Elevators failed. The pharmacy ran short of basic medications. Surgical supplies were rationed. Nurses who left were not replaced, and the remaining staff absorbed their patient loads on top of their own. The emergency department became a theater of managed chaos. Patients waited on stretchers in hallways for hours, sometimes days, because there were no beds available in the wards above. The psychiatric emergency room, already the busiest in the city, became even more overwhelmed as community mental health clinics across the 5 boroughs shut their doors. Patients who might have been treated in outpatient settings now had nowhere to go except Bellevue's front door. The physical deterioration was visible to anyone who walked through the building. Paint peeled from walls that had not been repainted in years. Windows cracked and were patched with tape. The heating system, ancient and unreliable, left certain wards sweltering in summer and freezing in winter. One physician who trained at Bellevue during this period later recalled performing examinations in a room where the ceiling tiles were stained brown from water damage, and a bucket sat in the corner collecting drips. This was not a field hospital in a war zone. This was the largest public hospital in the largest city in the United States. Workers at the hospital protested the budget cuts in 1976. They averted one round of layoffs by forgoing their cost of living increases for 2 years, a concession worth $10 million. The gesture was noble and insufficient. It could not replace the funding the city had withdrawn. It could not repair the infrastructure crumbling around them. It could only delay the visible consequences by a few months while the invisible ones accumulated. Meanwhile, Bellevue's new building, the 25-story tower, completed in 1939, was approaching middle age. Its electrical systems, its plumbing, its elevators, all were designed for the technology and patient volumes of the 1930s. By the mid-70s, the building was handling patient numbers and medical equipment that its original architects never imagined. The gap between the building's capacity and the city's demands grew wider every year. The human cost of the fiscal crisis would take decades to measure. Researchers at the City University of New York later calculated that the cuts in health, public safety, and social services during the mid-70s contributed directly to the epidemics that ravaged New York in the 80s and 90s: tuberculosis, HIV, and homicide. The long-term cost of controlling those 3 epidemics exceeded $50 billion. The total savings from the entire fiscal crisis amounted to approximately $10 billion. The city saved a dime and spent $5. The accounting was not just tragic, it was stupid, and Bellevue absorbed every cent of the consequence. The worst was still ahead. The crises that arrived in the 1980s would make the fiscal collapse look like a rehearsal. Chapter 8: The Emergency Room of Last Resort. By the 1980s, Bellevue's emergency room was the only door in New York that never closed and never turned anyone away. The decade that followed the fiscal crisis brought 3 overlapping catastrophes to New York City, and all 3 of them walked through Bellevue's front door. The first was AIDS. The disease appeared in New York in the early 1980s, concentrated initially among gay men and intravenous drug users. The city's public health infrastructure, already weakened by a decade of budget cuts, was wholly unprepared. The hospitals that remained open were underfunded. The disease surveillance systems that might have caught the epidemic earlier had been dismantled. Private hospitals, uncertain about transmission and wary of the social stigma, were reluctant to admit AIDS patients. Bellevue was not reluctant. Bellevue did not have the luxury of reluctance. It was a public hospital bound by mandate and by mission. It took whoever came through the door, and what came through the door, beginning around 1981 and accelerating for the next 15 years, was a wave of death unlike anything the hospital had seen since the great epidemics of the 19th century. The second catastrophe was crack cocaine. The drug arrived in New York's poorest neighborhoods in the mid-80s and tore through them with a velocity that stunned even the city's most experienced public health officials. Crack was cheap, powerfully addictive, and linked to an explosion of violent crime. The homicide rate, which had been declining slightly, reversed course and climbed sharply. By 1990, New York recorded over 2,000 homicides in a single year. Gunshot wounds became a routine feature of Bellevue's emergency room caseload. The hospital treated the victims and, in its prison ward, also treated the perpetrators. On some nights, they arrived in the same ambulance. The third catastrophe was homelessness, the destruction of single-room occupancy hotels, the deinstitutionalization of psychiatric patients without adequate community support, and the erosion of the social safety net during the fiscal crisis combined to produce a homeless population that grew from roughly 7,500 in 1982 to over 23,000 by 1992. Many of these individuals suffered from untreated mental illness, addiction, or both. They had no primary care physician. They had no stable address. When they got sick, or when the cold became unbearable, or when the voices in their heads grew too loud, they went to Bellevue. In 1998, the building that had formerly served as the hospital's psychiatric facility was converted into a homeless intake center and men's shelter. The building's function had changed. Its population had not. The psychiatric emergency room became a de facto shelter for people who had nowhere else to sleep. The forensic ward held prisoners alongside patients, guarded by corrections officers whose training did not include psychiatric care. The corridors filled with people waiting for beds that did not exist. Every social failure in New York City eventually arrived at Bellevue's front desk. And every social failure arrived looking the same. A person in crisis, without resources, without options, without anywhere else to turn. The staff who worked at Bellevue during this period developed a kind of institutional resilience that outsiders found difficult to comprehend. They treated gunshot victims in hallways. They managed psychiatric emergencies in rooms designed for storage. They improvised solutions to problems that no medical textbook addressed, because no medical textbook had been written for a hospital that functioned simultaneously as an emergency room, a psychiatric ward, a homeless shelter, a prison infirmary, and a teaching hospital. Bellevue doctors during the 80s and 90s became some of the most resourceful clinicians in the country, not because they chose adversity, but because adversity chose them. The numbers from this period are staggering in their cumulative weight. By the late 80s, Bellevue's emergency department was seeing over 100,000 visits per year. Its psychiatric emergency room was among the busiest in the country, evaluating thousands of patients annually for conditions ranging from acute psychosis to suicidal ideation, to simple exhaustion from sleeping on subway grates. The hospital employed over 5,000 staff. It treated patients across 25 stories of clinical space. And still, it could not keep up with the demand that the city's failures kept generating. The prison ward deserves special mention because it captured Bellevue's role at the intersection of medicine and punishment more vividly than anything else. Located on the 19th floor, the ward housed inmates from Rikers Island and other city correctional facilities who required medical or psychiatric treatment beyond what the jail infirmary could provide. The patients were sick. They were also, legally, prisoners. Corrections officers stood guard at the doors. The medical staff navigated a daily tension between their obligation to treat and the facility's obligation to confine. No private hospital in New York volunteered for this duty. Bellevue did not volunteer either. It was assigned the task because there was nobody else. And through it all, the building itself was aging. The main hospital complex dated from the mid-20th century. Its systems were outdated. Its infrastructure was strained. The backup generators, critical equipment for a hospital that could never afford to close, sat in the basement, where they had been installed in 1969. Nobody moved them. Nobody questioned the decision to place the machines that would keep patients alive during an emergency in the lowest point of a building that sat a few hundred yards from the East River. This was not malice. It was indifference, masquerading as normalcy. The generators worked. The building stood, and the city had bigger problems. That question of location would answer itself in 2012, and the answer would nearly kill the building that nothing else had managed to destroy. Chapter 9: 14 Feet of Water. On October 29, 2012, the Atlantic Ocean walked into Bellevue Hospital and climbed the stairs. Hurricane Sandy began as a tropical storm on October 22nd. Within 2 days, it was upgraded to a Category 1 hurricane. It struck Cuba and the Bahamas, gathered strength, and curved north along the eastern coast of the United States. Normally, Atlantic hurricanes encounter prevailing easterly winds that push them out to sea before they reach the northeast. Sandy was different. A stalled Arctic storm collided with the hurricane, creating what meteorologists call the Fujiwara effect, two weather systems rotating around each other like dancers. The combined storm turned directly toward New York. The city declared a state of emergency. Public transportation was suspended. Schools were closed. Mandatory evacuation orders were issued for low-lying areas. The National Guard deployed over 200 troops to Manhattan. President Obama declared the situation a disaster before the storm even made landfall, unlocking federal resources in advance. Bellevue sat on First Avenue at 27th Street, less than a quarter mile from the East River. The hospital had prepared for the storm. After Hurricane Irene the previous year, staff had built protective encasements around the basement fuel pumps, sealed with submarine-style airtight doors. They had modified the hospital's disaster plan. They believed the precautions were sufficient. The preparations were based on the best flood mapping data available at the time. The data was wrong. When the storm surge hit on Monday evening, seawater poured into lower Manhattan. At Bellevue, the water reached the basement and kept rising. It flooded the elevator shafts, disabling all 32 of the hospital's elevators. It poured over the submarine doors protecting the fuel pumps, overwhelming barriers that had been designed for a smaller storm. The basement filled. When the power went out, the backup generator on the 13th floor kicked in. The staff counted together. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi. The lights returned before 10. The generator was working. Ventilators and intravenous pumps hummed on without interruption. But downstairs, the basement fuel pumps were submerged. The generator had a limited fuel supply in its own tank. If the basement pumps could not be restored to bring fuel up to the 13th floor by midnight, the entire hospital would go dark. An impromptu fuel brigade formed. National Guard soldiers and hospital staff began carrying 5-gallon containers of diesel fuel up 13 flights of stairs, hand over hand, bucket brigade style. They bought hours, but they could not stop the water, and they could not repair what the water had destroyed. Oxygen tanks and medical interns were stationed at the bedside of every patient on a ventilator, just in case. By Tuesday morning, a second crisis emerged. The water supply was failing. Rooftop tanks that gravity-fed the entire building depended on pumps that had been damaged in the flood. The tanks held about a day's worth of water. Without functioning pumps to refill them, the hospital would run dry by Tuesday evening. Throughout the day, the highest-risk patients were quietly transferred to other hospitals. Patients in the intensive care unit, patients on ventilators, patients receiving dialysis. One by one, they were carried down the stairs and loaded into ambulances. Late on Tuesday, the water pressure began to drop. By evening, the supply ran out. The full evacuation order came on Wednesday, October 31st. Over the next 36 hours, staff carried patients down darkened stairwells in a hospital with no elevators, no running water, and failing power. Nurses climbed 17 flights with food trays and medicine. Emergency medical technicians carried patients on stretchers from the highest floors. Newborns from the neonatal unit wrapped against the cold. Psychiatric patients from the 19th floor forensic ward, some of them incarcerated, evacuated without the help of electronic communications or even functioning lights. Patients on ventilators, accompanied by interns manually squeezing breathing bags with each step downward. By the time the operation was finished, only 2 patients remained. Their conditions required an elevator for safe transport. Emergency crews pumped 10 million gallons of seawater from the basement. By Friday, 1 elevator was restored. The last 2 patients were evacuated safely. In total, approximately 700 patients had been removed from Bellevue in one of the largest hospital evacuations in American history. Not a single patient died during the operation, not one. In a building without power, without water, without elevators, staffed by people who had been working for 3 days straight, every patient survived the journey down the stairs and into the waiting ambulances. By Saturday, November 3, 2012, Bellevue was empty. For what was almost certainly the first time since 1736, there was not a single patient inside the building. The hospital sat dark and silent on First Avenue, in a stretch of lower Manhattan, still without electricity. A physician who walked past it that night later described it as looking like a hulking sculpture. Fragile, forlorn. 276 years of continuous operation had ended. The building that had survived yellow fever, cholera, typhus, the Civil War, 2 world wars, the Great Depression, the fiscal crisis, AIDS, and crack cocaine had been brought to silence by 14 feet of water and a set of backup generators stored in the basement for 43 years. The question was not whether Bellevue would reopen. The question was whether anyone would bother. Chapter 10. The Rebuilding. No one expected. 3 months after the floodwaters receded, Bellevue reopened, and almost nobody in New York noticed. In February of 2013, patients began returning to Bellevue. The reopening was not accompanied by ribbon cuttings or press conferences. It was quiet, almost reflexive, the way a heart resumes beating after defibrillation, not because anyone decided it should, but because stopping was never really an option. New York City committed $300 million for immediate repairs. Eventually, the total cost of the post-Sandy restoration would reach approximately $750 million. The scope of the work was enormous. The generators were relocated to higher floors. New flood barriers were designed and installed. The fuel delivery system was completely rebuilt so that the hospital could sustain itself even if the basement flooded again. Electrical systems were hardened. Medical equipment was replaced. The infrastructure was rebuilt not merely to the standards that had existed before the storm, but to standards that assumed the next storm would be worse. The restoration took years to complete fully. While the emergency department and essential services reopened within months, the complete renovation of the hospital's infrastructure continued into 2015 and beyond. New submarine-grade flood doors were installed at every ground-level entrance. A massive berm was constructed around the perimeter of the campus. The electrical switchgear was elevated above the flood line. $750 million. That figure is worth pausing on. It is roughly the gross domestic product of a small island nation. It would have built a new hospital from scratch in most American cities. Instead, it was spent restoring a building that the city could not bear to lose. FEMA issued updated flood elevation data reflecting the new reality of storm surge in lower Manhattan. The old maps had been based on historical patterns that no longer applied. Sandy had rewritten the rules. The hospital planned for a future in which 100-year storms arrived every decade. But the physical restoration, dramatic as it was not the most revealing part of the story. The most revealing part was simpler. The city could have let Bellevue die. In the weeks after Sandy, when the building sat dark and empty, there was no legal obligation to bring it back. Other hospitals in Manhattan could absorb some of the patient load. The site could have been sold to developers. The land alone, a prime stretch of East Side real estate between the East River and First Avenue, was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. In a city where a single apartment can sell for $50 million, the financial logic of letting Bellevue go was, on paper, compelling. Nobody seriously proposed it. Not the mayor, not the governor, not the hospital administrators, not the budget analysts who spent their days looking for expenditures to cut. The decision to rebuild Bellevue was not really a decision at all. It was a reflex built into the city's nervous system over nearly 3 centuries. New York needed a place to send the people no other institution would accept. It had always needed such a place, and Bellevue had always been that place. The reflex was older than the Republic, older than the Constitution, older than every other institution in the city except the city itself. The building came back, the wards filled, the emergency room hummed. Within a year, it was as if the flood had never happened, except for the new generators on the upper floors, a silent monument to the 43 years of institutional inertia that had placed them in the basement. Bellevue had survived again. The pattern held, and the next crisis was already forming invisibly in the bloodstream of a bat thousands of miles away. Chapter 11. The patients no one else will take. Today, Bellevue still does what it has always done. It takes the call that every other hospital sends to voicemail. In October of 2014, a physician named Craig Spencer returned to New York from Guinea, where he had been treating Ebola patients with Doctors Without Borders. Days after his arrival, he developed a fever. He was transported to Bellevue Hospital, where staff activated protocols that had been developed and drilled in the months since the Ebola outbreak had exploded across West Africa. Spencer was isolated in a specially prepared biocontainment unit. Over 100 hospital workers were deployed to his care. For 19 days, the staff of a public hospital in Manhattan treated one of the deadliest infectious diseases on the planet. Spencer recovered. Not a single secondary infection occurred among the more than 100 personnel who treated him. The Ebola case was not an accident of geography. It was the continuation of a pattern that stretches back to the yellow fever quarantines of the 1790s. When a pathogen arrives that nobody fully understands, when the protocols do not yet exist, when private hospitals weigh the risk against their reputation, Bellevue steps into the gap. After Spencer's recovery, Bellevue was designated as a regional emerging special pathogen treatment center, one of a handful of facilities in the country equipped to handle the most dangerous infectious diseases known to science. The hospital that began as a 6-bed almshouse was now the place the federal government trusted with diseases that could trigger a national emergency. Then came 2020. When COVID swept through New York City in March of that year, Bellevue faced a surge that dwarfed anything in its modern history. The virus arrived fast. Within 2 weeks, the emergency department was overwhelmed. Hundreds of patients arrived every day, many of them struggling to breathe, many of them alone because visitors were not allowed. Ambulance sirens became the background soundtrack of the neighborhood, constant and unrelenting. The hospital expanded its critical care capacity virtually overnight, repurposing wards, converting conference rooms, turning the cafeteria into a triage area, doing whatever was necessary to create space for the tide of sick that would not stop rising. Staff worked around the clock, often at great personal risk, in the early weeks when the supply of protective equipment was uncertain and the nature of the disease was poorly understood. The average daily patient census, which before the pandemic had hovered around 565, climbed above 700 and peaked at over 840. Bellevue developed treatment protocols that were shared with hospitals across the city and eventually across the country. Once again, the oldest public hospital in America was on the front line of an epidemic that nobody was prepared for. Once again, it absorbed the blow because nobody else would. The modern profile of Bellevue tells the full story in compressed form. The hospital serves as the city's primary psychiatric emergency center, evaluating over 25,000 patients a year. It operates a forensic psychiatric unit for incarcerated patients. It runs one of the busiest emergency departments in New York, treating over 100,000 visits annually. It is a Level 1 trauma center. It is the designated hospital for visiting presidents, United Nations diplomats, and foreign heads of state. It treats patients in more than 80 languages. It employs over 5,000 staff and 1,200 attending physicians. And it still takes anyone who walks through the door, regardless of ability to pay. The richest city in the world still needs a hospital of last resort. That fact, more than any architectural detail or medical first, defines what Bellevue is. Not a monument to charity. Charity implies a choice. Bellevue is a monument to necessity. It exists because 8 million people, generating a gross metropolitan product measured in hundreds of billions of dollars, still produce human beings who fall through every net. Bellevue is where they land. It has always been where they land. The question is not whether Bellevue will survive. Bellevue always survives. The question is what its survival says about the city and the country that requires it. Every year, the hospital treats patients from over 150 countries. It delivers babies for undocumented immigrants. It sets broken bones for construction workers who fell from scaffolding. It provides psychiatric care for veterans, for refugees, for people whose first language is not spoken by any other institution in the city. It does all of this on a budget that would be considered inadequate for a hospital half its size, in a city half as expensive. And it does it because the alternative, turning people away, is something that Bellevue, alone among American institutions, has never done. Chapter 12. The Monument We Cannot Name. After nearly 300 years, the question Bellevue asks America is the same one it asked in 1736. What do you owe the people you would prefer not to see? The building stands today on First Avenue, a 25-story tower of concrete and glass, flanked by the older structures that have accumulated around it like geological strata. Walk past it on a Tuesday afternoon and you will see ambulances arriving. You will see patients entering through the emergency department doors. You will see staff in scrubs crossing the street for coffee. It looks like any other large urban hospital. It is nothing like any other large urban hospital. Bellevue is not a monument to medical progress, though medical progress has happened inside it more often and more dramatically than in almost any other American institution. It is not a monument to compassion, though acts of extraordinary compassion occur within its walls every day. And it is not a monument to neglect, though neglect has been woven into its history since the first bed was placed on the second floor of the almshouse in 1736. Bellevue is a monument to the compromise. The ongoing, never-resolved, endlessly renegotiated compromise between what a society owes its most vulnerable members and what that society is willing to spend. Every American city has some version of this negotiation. New York's version just happens to be nearly 3 centuries old, located on some of the most expensive real estate on Earth, and attached to a name that has entered the American language as a synonym for madness. Think about what that means in practical terms. A few blocks from Bellevue, condominiums sell for thousands of dollars per square foot. The restaurants that line the avenues nearby charge $50 for a plate of pasta. The private hospitals of the Upper East Side, gleaming towers of marble and glass, cater to patients who arrive by limousine and recover in rooms that resemble hotel suites. And in the middle of all this wealth, on a campus that has occupied the same stretch of riverfront since the 18th century, stands a public hospital that will treat anyone who walks through the door, even if that person has no money, no insurance, no identification, and no address. The coexistence of these two realities within a few city blocks is not an accident. It is the story of American medicine in miniature. The name itself carries the weight of the contradiction. Bellevue, beautiful view, named for the sweep of the East River visible from the original estate, the green hills of Long Island fading into the distance. That view still exists technically, but the word Bellevue no longer evokes beauty for most Americans. It evokes something harder to define. It evokes the place where a society sends the people it has failed, and the place where some of those people are saved despite that failure, and the place where all of them are at least acknowledged as existing. That acknowledgement is not nothing. For many of Bellevue's patients, it is the only acknowledgement they receive. Consider the numbers one final time. 6 beds in 1736. Over 100,000 emergency visits per year in the 21st century. 25,000 psychiatric evaluations annually, a staff of more than 5,000, nearly 300 years of continuous operation, interrupted only once by a storm that flooded the basement and exposed what 43 years of institutional inertia had hidden in plain sight. Each of those numbers represents a person. Each of those persons arrived at Bellevue because every other door was closed. The pattern that began in 1736 has not broken. The city still grows. People still fall through the cracks. Epidemics still arrive without warning. And when they do, Bellevue absorbs the impact, the way a breakwater absorbs the force of a wave, not gracefully, not without damage, but persistently, stubbornly, with a durability that no budget cut, no scandal, no hurricane, and no cultural stigma has managed to overcome. This is the legacy, not progress, not failure, something more honest than either. Bellevue is the evidence that America has never fully decided whether public medicine is an act of compassion or an act of containment. It has been both, often at the same time, in the same building, on the same afternoon. And the building keeps standing because the question keeps going unanswered. The 6 beds are gone. The iron rings are gone. The horses that pulled the first ambulance are gone. The floodwaters have receded. The pandemic has retreated. But the door is still open. It has always been open. And someone is walking through it right now. For nearly 300 years, one public hospital has served as both the birthplace of American medicine and the dumping ground for everyone the city wanted to forget. Neither side of that story makes sense without the other.